Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Leslie Perez, the Marketing and Communications Coordinator at CISCRP. I want to welcome everyone to the Patient Engagement Insights, where we'll be where highlights from the latest 2019 CISCRP Perceptions and Insights study will be shared. We have three distinguished presenters with us today: Ken Getz, the founder and board chair at CISCRP, and Deputy Director and Professor at the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, Anik DeBrun, Director of Research Services at CISCRP, and Jasmine Benger, Senior Project Manager of Research Services, who will share key insights on how the perceptions of clinical research have changed over the years, patient engagement preferences, and ways to improve clinical trial experiences. So before we get started, I just have a few items to cover. Everyone has been placed on mute upon entry. Please remain on mute for the duration of the webinar to avoid any noise or sound issues as the webinar is being recorded. Please use the chat feature in WebEx to submit your questions. You can send in your questions at any time throughout the webinar. These will be addressed at the end during the Q&A session. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for archive viewing on the CISCRP website. You will receive instructions after the webinar for how to access and view the recording. So without further ado, we'll get started. It is my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Anik DeBrun.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Leslie. Welcome, everyone. I just wanted to extend our gratitude and thank you. We're very excited to share the results from our latest 2019 Perceptions and Insights study. You'll see that there's a lot of exciting findings here that will help inform your patient engagement strategies going forward. And we hope you find these results as interesting as we did as we analyze them. So what we have planned for you today, the next hour will be jam-packed. I'll be going over an overview of our methods and as well as the respondent characteristics and profiles. We'll then go into 4 distinct sections. Ken will take us through the general awareness and perception section. And Jasmine will be covering the decision to participate as well as some engagement preferences as expressed by patients and the public. And I'll be closing out the session with experiences from well over 3,600 study volunteers, prior study volunteers. So we're very excited to get started. So Leslie, if we can go to the next slide. The first thing we wanted to cover is, so we've been conducting this study for quite a few years now. We conduct this study every 2 years. And every 2 years, we work with a cross-functional work group with various stakeholders and representatives that we work with. And basically what we do is we work with the prior year's questionnaire, and we discuss relevant topics that need to be included. And basically, we obviously keep some questions exactly the same for longitudinal analyses, but like I mentioned, we also include new topic areas as our industry is evolving. We collected the data over the summer, and we worked with our partners once again to disseminate the survey. We want to extend a special thank you to Accurian, Clarinet, Continuum Clinical, CureClick, and IQVIA. We're happy to report that we had an amazing sample size once again, comparable to 2017. We ended up with a final sample size of 12,451 participants. Leslie, if we can go to the next slide. So this is a high-level overview of some of the characteristics over the years. You'll see since 2015, we've had over 12,000 respondents. And we've had generally a good mix of gender and a good distribution of different regions. Just a couple of highlights that I wanted to point out. We did have a little bit more respondents this year from North America, particularly the US, than we did in 2017. But given the large sample size, we still have great representation from the other regions, Europe in particular, and the Asia Pacific region. We also wanted to highlight that we do have a good distribution in terms of education and other socioeconomic variables. It is a heavily white and non-Hispanic sample. However, again, with a large sample size, we do have very robust sample sizes for the minority and other population subgroups. And Leslie, if we can go to the next slide. I wanted to just zone in on the clinical trial participants portion of the study. So typically it's a very broad study where we ask questions of the general public, and that's and typically the survey branches into those that have had clinical trial experience. Now, out of the 12,000 plus participants that we had, about 3,650 had participated in a clinical trial in the past. And this is just a profile of those participants. So we had a good mix of interventional study participants as well as observational and a few expanded access study participants. Most of them, and not surprisingly, were not able to recall what phase or weren't sure what phase study they participated in, but the others that did recall, we had a good mix. We also had a mix of disease severity and a mix of therapeutic areas. The average study duration was about 8.5 months. On average, a little over 6 study visits over the duration of their participation. About 3/4 completed the study, and we have some great data here about, reasons also why people stopped their participation as well, and what that participant profile looks like. And then again, the breakout by region, also a bit heavier on North America, but is also very representative of the global representation of study participants as well. Now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Ken, who will take us through the general perceptions and awareness measures that we collected.
Thanks, Anik, and I want to personally welcome everyone to this webinar today. And as Anik pointed out, we have such a robust sample that over the coming months, we're going to be continuing to do a deeper dive into many of the different subgroups. So today, we're going to really start with a very high-level look at the overall sample, and we'll call out a few of the subgroup differences. And I also want to say that it's really a privilege to be co-presenting with members of the CISCRP team, including Anik, Jasmine, and Leslie. So I'll begin with a very high-level look at general public awareness and perceptions. And I'm going to take sort of a 30,000-foot view of all of the global perceptions that really point to and indicate high importance that's attributed to clinical research, high self-reported understanding of the term clinical research study, a high level of general trust in the stakeholders who conduct and oversee clinical research and in clinical research safety in general. But there are a couple of key highlights that we want to point out as well. The findings in many of our sections are very consistent with those that we've observed in the past perceptions and insight studies. We do continue to see a number of factors, however, that are associated with higher and lower general perceptions. For example, familiarity and exposure to clinical research is associated with more positive perceptions, as you would expect. We also observe a number of subgroup differences by geographic area, for example, by many demographic variables, including gender, age, race, and ethnicity. And all of these are suggestive of opportunities to target general education to inform some of these lower perceptions or to address some of the areas where we see really wide disparities. I also want to point out that although there is high general awareness, there is a gap between awareness and actions that can be taken. And you'll see that as we start to go through the results. A high percentage of the public doesn't really know where to turn or who can advocate for them if a clinical research study is to be considered. So although awareness is high, a lot of our focus has to be on educating the public around actions that can be taken. So let's look at some of the key results. Leslie, if you can go to the next slide. On the left-hand portion of this slide, 98% of the public indicates that they view clinical research as very or somewhat important to the discovery and development of new medicines. 98% which is very high, and this perception has not changed since our 2015 study. We can also look on the right-hand side, 97% of past participants and 90% of those who've never participated self-report understanding what is meant by the term clinical research study. And this perception, too, has not changed significantly over time. Leslie, if we can go to the next slide. 92% of the public regards clinical research studies as somewhat and very safe. And this is generally consistent with the past assessments that we've conducted in 2013, 2015, and 2017. We do observe some subgroup differences by race and ethnicity, with a much higher percentage of the Asian community viewing clinical research as not very or not at all safe. And here again, a theme that I called out earlier, past participation is associated with much higher, significantly higher perceived safety. Let's go to the next slide. We can dig a little bit deeper into that proportion of the community that views clinical research studies as not safe. And among that small overall percentage, the top reason is the possibility of side effects, with 2/3 choosing this as a primary reason. Distant other reasons include a lack of trust, a belief that their medical condition may get worse, particularly if a placebo is given, and that they also don't know enough about the study. 35% indicate that they don't trust pharmaceutical companies, and we'll go there next as we talk about general perceptions. Let's go to the next slide. Approximately 1 in 5 global public citizens don't trust that pharmaceutical companies will give full and accurate information about the risks and benefits of an investigational new medicine. And the North American public is the least trusting of other global regions, as are older members of the public who are less trusting than the younger community, than younger counterparts. This is a new question, and we don't have a longitudinal data for comparisons. You'll also note, however, that the level of trust is significantly higher among those who have been a participant in the past. And again, that really speaks to the incredible importance of familiarity and exposure to clinical research, whether it's through actual participation or if there are ways that we can educate the public by giving them insight into what it means to be a trial participant and what it's like to interact with other stakeholders supporting the research enterprise. Let's go to the next slide. Here we're just looking at the perceived trust in other organizations that are involved in clinical research. And you see that a smaller relative proportion of the public don't trust these other stakeholder groups. In fact, half or less of that untrusting proportion in the prior slide feel that way. 1 in 10 don't trust research centers, and 1 in 20 indicate that they don't trust regulatory agencies that oversee the safety of our studies, and government agencies, government research organizations that design and pay for clinical research studies. Let's go to the next slide. We're now going to shift gears and look at public recall, seeing or hearing about a clinical research study during the past 6 months. And again, familiarity and direct experience as a study volunteer plays a part here and is associated with higher recall, with 80% indicating so. Among those who've never participated, roughly half that proportion, 43%, recall seeing or hearing about a study. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the top areas that have triggered that recall. 41%, for example, recall hearing about or learning about a clinical research study through an online advertisement, 30% through traditional mass media, And this is one area where we continue to see an evolution and change over time, where mass media was the most prevalent source for clinical research information in the past. Now it's really the online environment, including the 22% that report hearing about a study through an online social media community or finding information through an online clinical trial registry. Let's just go to the next slide now, the last slide in this section, where we look at the healthcare provider involvement as a critical information source. And we know that the public regards the healthcare provider as the #1 source for health-related information. However, approximately 1/3 of the public reports considering a clinical trial when they're discussing a treatment or medication option with their primary care or treating physician. And interestingly and curiously, that percentage is only slightly higher among those who report having a severe or a serious illness or disease. And this emphasizes the point that was made earlier about having high awareness, but not necessarily having all the steps in place to act on that awareness if it were appropriate. On the right-hand side of this chart, 2/3 of the public, however, reports being confident that they could convince their primary care or treating physician to consider a clinical research study as an option for them. So let's now go to and begin our next section, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to Jasmine, who will walk us through some of the results associated with deciding to participate in a clinical research study.
So while we wait for Jasmine, I'm happy to take over this section. So some of the highlights here, we really took a deep dive into looking at key informational elements that really impact and influence someone's decision to participate. And what we found, as in prior years, is that prior study participants are much more willing, and as Ken mentioned, much more informed and comfortable with the idea of clinical research participation. But there is still, in terms of the current state, many have never been asked to participate. So, of course, some of the critical information that really influences a decision includes risks and benefits, the purpose of a clinical study, of course, the medical procedure required, procedures required, confidentiality, and of course, various logistical aspects, which are always what we hear in some of our other work, some of the key elements that are most important when looking at considering participation. Obviously, travel to a study clinic, what are some of the overall costs and reimbursements and expenses associated with participation, and of course, how long is their commitment. What we've seen in this study and in years past as well is that the doctors are really a wonderful channel and can really have a positive impact on participation decisions and overall willingness to participate. And in particular, if their own doctor is conducting the trial, it has an even higher conversion rate possibility. So if you can go to the next slide.
So kind of as I think Anika alluded to on the previous slide, we've seen an overall willingness to participate remain high over the last few years, with a small increase from our previous study in 2017. And again, this is likely due slightly to the fact that we had a higher proportion of former study volunteers. And as you can see on the right-hand side, those that have participated previously in a clinical research study are more willing to take part. So, while again, overall willingness is high, we did want to just point out a few subgroup learnings that we want to highlight as well. So older individuals were slightly more willing to participate than younger individuals. And then interestingly, those that self-reported their condition to be very severe were surprisingly not more willing necessarily to consider participation over those who considered their condition to be mild. So Leslie, on the next slide, again, while overall participation and willingness to participate remains higher, the majority of individuals haven't been asked to participate in clinical research. So as you can see, more than half have indicated that they've never been asked. So again, this is just kind of something to think about because, again, that points out a potential opportunity there. And we also know that, as we've seen in years past and as was confirmed in this year's study, many people would like to learn about clinical trial opportunities from their doctor. Those who have actually been asked to participate have learned about the opportunity, been presented with the opportunity by a number of different channels. Most common were emails from the research center or from a patient recruitment company, but also, again, through a telephone call or something like that as well. With regards to some kind of key learnings here, older people were more likely to be asked or to report being asked than younger individuals, which does kind of intuitively make sense in thinking that, as we age, we may have some more health-related issues. And then respondents of African descent were also more likely to have been asked to participate in clinical research as opposed to those other races. So on the next slide, again, we wanted to also kind of look at some of the key information that people need when they're making this decision to take part in clinical research. And so, kind of shifting gears into that direction, what's most important for people to be able to make their really an informed participation experience. So we asked individuals to rate, you can see here on the slide, these different factors and how important it was to know each of the following types of information before they had made their decision to take part. Overall, the top pieces of information that people said they were really interested in were potential risks and benefits, the purpose of the research study, and the type of medical procedures that were required. But, again, not to negate, the importance of confidentiality, logistical aspects that really play into burden, so like the length of commitment, the distance and location of the study, as well as how important it was to have, access to information. For example, the summary of study results after their participation ended was also really important. Overall, also, you can kind of see on the screen here, those that had never participated in a clinical trial found all of these items to be more important, considering or as compared to those that had participated. And women and older individuals were actually more apt as well to say that all of these different factors were very important to their participation decision as opposed to younger individuals and males. Older individuals also, those over 65 in particular, considered time off work being compensated to be less important than the other age groups. The younger age groups found this particular factor to be more important, which again could very well be due to older individuals being retired. So looking again on the next slide, as in years past and just kind of as we've heard during the course of our other engagement and initiatives with patients, the role of the healthcare provider, their personal doctor, it really does just have such a huge impact on an individual's decision to participate in a clinical research study. And so, not only were primary care physicians or specialists reported to be the most trusted source of advice about clinical trials, but more than half stated that they would be more willing to take part in a clinical research study if their own doctor was involved overall. So that's sort of just something to kind of think about as well. As you can see, research center doctor or study staff conducting the study were also, important top mentions, as was individuals, significant other or their partner. And some interesting kind of learnings as well here. Younger individuals were slightly less apt to trust their doctor's advice and were instead more trusting of extended friends and families and significant others as opposed to older individuals. So again, these learnings just really, again, highlight an opportunity to hopefully leverage that relationship with the healthcare provider to provide education and really more information about clinical trial opportunities to patients. And to round out this section on the next slide, we've been seeing really this continued interest in an online way to connect with others. So we wanted to kind of zero in particularly on this and how it could potentially influence a decision to participate in the trial. So 75%, as you can see, reports they were somewhat or very interested in discussing and getting advice on participation in a research study with peers in an online community. Not super surprising, but there was a higher interest in this opportunity among a younger group of individuals, as well as those that identified as Black, and then those from South America and African descent were also more willing and more interested to take part in something like this as well. So, that kind of rounds out our decision-making process section, but I also wanted to dive a little bit deeper into engagement preferences on the next slide of those that, and again, we're seeing all these different new ways that, people want to be engaged with over the course of a clinical trial, and so, we wanted to really explore that a bit more in this year's study. We found, and this is again what we hear over the course of our patient advisory boards and other interactions with patients, but options are really key. Everyone's individual journey is so very different, and so it's just important, I think, to kind of keep that in mind as we review these findings. We also took a look at clinical trial models in particular, as we're seeing all these new kind of variations or hybrid models of studies where people are going to a clinic and maybe have some visits at home or have a nurse potentially come to the home. So we're able to kind of look into this a little bit more in this year's findings, and I'll review that on a separate slide. But we really find too, and kind of I think a key takeaway in this section is that, overall access to information, not only just about their condition, but about the study itself, really kind of trumps some of the more convenience-enhancing initiatives, such as like a concierge service or things like that. People really, just want to have as much information as they can. And that kind of plays into my next point about how there is a continued high interest in receiving a summary of overall study results as well as their own individual results. And we also, dive a little bit into the preferred method to get this information, and email and regular mail remain kind of the most preferred methods of delivery, but we are seeing interest in some other methods as well. So on the next slide, we asked individuals, if you were to participate in a clinical research study, how important were each of the following factors to your participation? So this information here that you can see is the individuals that reported percent that indicated these factors to be very important. So again, this is where we see the importance of information and access to background and supporting information about the study, as well as information about their own health and condition just in general, really remain kind of some of the top desired pieces that are really important to a person's individual participation experience. So again, we also looked at some subgroups, and we found that overall, women ranked all of these items to be a bit more important than men in their as far as how they'd like to be engaged with. And then older people were interesting also. They wanted to have a way to communicate their feedback back to the study a bit more than younger individuals. So again, that would be providing a survey back to their clinical research site just about their overall experience. So older individuals found that more interesting. So on the next slide, again, we talked a little bit about which model is more appealing when we're seeing all of these, new and emerging models of clinical trials. So we looked specifically at, health data being collected all at home, a nurse coming to a patient's home for some or of their study visits, for all of their study visits, and then lastly, kind of a hybrid model where some visits would be conducted at home and some would be conducted at the clinic. And we provided, a little description of each of these items before we were asking individuals to, for their feedback. And, as you can kind of see just here visually, there really isn't a clear overall winner. There wasn't a preferred model just across the board. But we did have some interesting learnings, when we kind of dove a little bit deeper into some subgroups. So as far as, women, for example, they found really nurse coming to the home and collecting their own data to be a bit more appealing than men. And then older individuals found, some visits at home and some at the clinic to be less desirable as well. And we think that, this may be because of an older population may be a bit more apt to, desire a more traditional relationship with their doctor. So going to a study site, for example, or, really being able to be in person with someone. So again, there's really, I think, no clear winner, but it just, again, highlights the fact that it's so important to be able to offer options to people because everyone's experience is just a little bit different. So on the next slide, kind of on the same page as new technologies and emerging ways to try to reduce the burden of participation, we're seeing, apps and trackers and wearables being used in more and more to try to reduce the burden of participation to, obtain patient-reported outcomes and other learnings. So we wanted to really kind of think about if people would prefer to use their own device or their own phone or be supplied with one by the study. And again, as you can see, there is no clear winner. What we're finding is that, it just really depends on the individual, and that there's a lot of different kind of factors that may go into people's decision about this. Younger people were a little bit more apt to want to use their own smartphones, whereas older respondents, those particularly 55 and above, seem to want to use a separate smartphone, so to keep that kind of, really kind of separate from their personal device. We found that there was no significant difference between anyone that had participated previously and those with no clinical trial experience at all. But, again, this potentially could all tie back in terms of preferences to concerns about data collection and privacy. So, we think that these factors may play into people's decisions as well if they were to have a preference, because that's something that we hear in our patient advisory boards as well. So kind of shifting gears and turning now on the next slide to, how people would like to be engaged with after the clinical trial ends. Again, we find that all too often people feel a little bit lost or disconnected after their trial ends. So, we always want to make sure that we're kind of inquiring a bit as to how we can help support, that connection post-study. So particularly we asked what information individuals would be most interested in receiving after they completed participation in a clinical trial. And again, just being provided with that information is so critical to a person's experience. And I think it also helps to really communicate how they play a role in the overall process of research. So, again, the study of summary results and their individual results were really most important, followed by information like study drug or placebo and information about upcoming studies and some others. Just quickly to point out some kind of regional and age differences. North America were more likely to say a summary of study results and individual results than other regions. And older individuals were also more likely to be interested in a summary of results and individual study results compared to younger individuals. And to close out the section on the next slide, I just want to highlight again, we know how important it is to receive a summary with 85% reporting. It should be somewhat or very important to receive a summary of the results of their clinical research study, but how would they want to receive that information? So we asked this question as well. And we found that, an email delivery was the top, followed by regular mail, so some more traditional methods of delivery. But, interestingly, or not too interestingly, actually, an older population was more interested in wanting a printed summary as opposed to a younger age group, which was more interested in a webinar or a video, patient portal, teleconference, or having information disseminated through a patient advocacy group about the outcome of the trial as well. So kind of just in closing out, I think this section really, again, just highlights the importance for options and just reiterates, I think, to all of us how incredibly important it is to have access to information and how, at the end of the day, this really is just so critical to their overall experience. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anik to walk us through the participation experiences section.
Thanks, Jasmine. So I just wanted to, I see a lot of questions are coming through the chat. I just wanted to answer right now the quick ones here. I just wanted to mention, and I apologize if I didn't mention this earlier in the methods section, the survey was administered online, and as I mentioned, we did partner with certain agencies to disseminate the survey. And the questionnaire was largely closed-ended questions, not open-ended. We only had one, and I'll show you the results in this particular section where we asked participants about their opinion on if they found the informed consent form to be difficult to expand on their answer. But it was mostly closed-ended questions. So if we can move to the next slide, Leslie. What I'll be describing in the next couple of slides is the experiences of prior study volunteers. Now, again, I'll be showing you data from 3,600 plus folks that participated in a past clinical trial. So with the advent of, patient centricity, we know that many sponsor companies and CROs and other organizations are implementing various convenience-enhancing solutions and initiatives, and we were really interested in taking a look and seeing what kind of an impact these solutions are having. And what we found is that they are having a positive impact. So we found particularly electronic consent forms. They were viewed as easier to understand than other formats. But we also saw that other solutions were having a very positive impact in terms of overall experience, meeting expectations, et cetera. So the good news is that we are having a good, hopefully everybody can hear me, but having a good impact. However, there are still the traditional burdens of participation that still persist. Travel to the study clinic, study duration visits, diagnostic tests, still reported as the top burdens of participation and really the top items that are really affecting experiences. In addition, the engagement after clinical study participation is still lacking. People are still left hanging and never hear back after their last study visit. But generally speaking, overall satisfaction remains high. And I think we hear this qualitatively often. They have a great experience, and a lot of it is shaped by clinical trial site staff, and really that relationship they have with the site staff really makes a difference. But in terms of indications of satisfaction, many would recommend the experience, and many are willing to participate again. So Leslie, if we can go to the next slide. So the first question we asked is, where did they learn about the clinical research study? And we took a look at where people indicated they first learned in 2013 and compared it to 2019. And, some of these options have changed over the years, particularly with the advent of online forums and resources for information. And what we found is, generally speaking, some of the other areas remain fairly consistent in terms of, percentages. There was naturally growth in online communities, and as well as the government online database also showed some growth from earlier on 2013 to 2019. We did identify some subgroup differences. In particular, we found that those that identified as Black or of African descent were more likely to mention the government online database. And the non-Hispanic population were also more likely to say they learned about it through a research center or study doctor staff than Hispanic populations. And there were some other variations in other subgroups as well. If we can go to the next slide. So again, I think this is very consistent from 2017. The primary drivers for participation are those, obviously obtaining better treatment for their conditions, but also those altruistic reasons, helping to advance science, helping others. Monetary compensation also ranks up there. And in diving a little bit deeper into the various subgroups and determining what are influencing these drivers, we do see that among older populations, those altruistic reasons are more prevalent. Compared to younger populations, and younger populations are also more likely to mention monetary compensation as well. We also, one of the other areas we looked at is the disease severity. Those with moderate to severe conditions, self-reportedly, were more likely to mention obtaining better treatment, but also, mention those altruistic reasons as well, compared to those with milder conditions. If we go to the next slide. So we took a look at the informed consent form and the various formats that they received the informed consent document in. And what we saw is some growth in terms of an electronic delivery, such as on an iPad or tablet or some other electronic device compared to 2017. Paper is still predominantly being used, and in particular, when we looked at various subgroups, the older population were more likely to mention paper versus younger, which were more likely to mention electronic or video. The number of pages among those that received paper, there's still a good third. Again, this is self-reported. That mentioned the document length was about 11 pages or more. It did vary. We took a look at the type of study as well, from observational to interventional to expanded access studies. And observational trials, those that participated in observational trials were more likely to mention that it was shorter in length versus an interventional or expanded access study. If we can go to the next slide, Leslie. So again, taking a look at some of the practices out there in terms of how they read the informed consent form. And again, this is self-reported, but we asked them a question. This was new this year. Which of the following statements best describe how you read the informed consent form? So about 63% said they read it in detail from beginning to end. About 14% said they only read certain sections, and 20% said they quickly glanced through it. Older people were more likely to read the form in detail versus younger people. On the right-hand side, this was interesting. About 3/4 said they signed the form soon after they reviewed it, in pretty much less than 24 hours. And about the balance said they took it home and then signed it on a different day. There were no significant differences by type of study. Respondents, in fact, from North America were more likely to say that they took less than 24 hours than respondents from other regions. In particular, respondents from the Asia-Pacific regions were more likely to take longer to review their informed consent forms. If we can go to the next slide, please. So here, again, it's self-reported perceived understanding. And you'll see here what I mentioned earlier in my highlights is that 61% reported of those that received an electronic informed consent form reported the form to be very easy to understand, which is significantly higher than those that received paper or video. This is where we included the open-ended question where we followed up and asked, among those that said it was very difficult, these are, some of the answers or responses that we received on an open-ended basis, healthcare jargon, confusing wording, rereading it to make sure they understand, very technical and medical, and didn't truly understand what I was agreeing to. So again, quite interesting to probe that a little bit more deeply. Younger people, in terms of subgroup differences, younger people found the informed consent form to be more difficult to understand, generally speaking, than older folks. And as well as those that self-reportedly had severe conditions, they had a harder time understanding it than those with less severe conditions. In addition, those respondents that were from Europe and the Asia-Pacific regions found it less easy than those respondents from North America as well. If we can go to the next slide. So about 3/4 of the respondents reported that they completed participation in the clinical trial, the entire study, and about 14% said they stopped before their last study visit. And then among those that stopped, we asked, reasons why they stopped participating, and we divided them into voluntary reasons, so, making the decision on your own to stop participating versus involuntary. And the top involuntary reasons were side effects or their lab results disqualified them. On the left-hand side, again, it was a lot of logistical elements, time commitment, location, and poor communication with the study center was mentioned quite frequently. In terms of subgroup differences, we saw that younger people were more likely to stop early versus older people, as well as those of Asian descent. And again, in terms of reasons for stopping participation, those from the Asia-Pacific region were also more likely to report poor communication with the study center, and some of the procedures being too cumbersome as well. If we can go to the next slide. So I mentioned some of the top burdens of participation, and I think what we saw in 2017 is a bit of a shift in terms of how much of an effect it had on their daily routine. So thinking about the protocols becoming more complex, more that is being asked of study participants, both at the clinic as well as at home, in terms of, especially with the advent of new technology, smartphone apps and things of that nature, asking them to complete questionnaires at home and other activities. There was a little bit of a higher percentage that reported the experience to be a little bit more on the disruptive side. Some of the top perceived burdens, again, the diagnostic tests, length of study visits, as well as traveling to the study clinic. And interestingly, we asked folks, how long did you travel? This is one way, in fact. And 66% said at least 30 minutes to an hour times 2, so minimum an hour. So imagine doing that a couple of times a month or a year or whatever the study requires. So that was quite interesting as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. So a lot of new initiatives are being implemented, and we wanted to track some of the growth of some of these initiatives. And what we saw is a lot of patient experience surveys, kind of like patient satisfaction surveys, are being administered. In particular, some major areas of growth are text messaging, smartphone apps, concierge services as well, where what we meant, and we included a description of this, but this is basically, arranging transportation to a clinical site location, or, having a travel agent involved. So things of that nature. And then, and also we saw a lower proportion where none of these items were offered as well. So again, growth in some of these initiatives from 2017 to 2019. And when taking a look, and Leslie, if we can go to the next slide, we took a look at, what kind of effect were these initiatives having on overall satisfaction and expectations. And what we found is, of those that did not have anything offered or used, or didn't use any of these services, compared to those that had these services offered, there was a significant impact in terms of how well their study met their overall expectations. And you'll see here, highest, there were only 77 here that did report childcare, but that was one of the things that had the most impact in terms of their overall experience meeting their expectations, as well as some of these others. These were all significantly higher in terms of exceeded and greatly exceeded expectations versus those that had nothing offered or didn't use anything during the clinical trial. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, in terms of receiving updates during the study while they're enrolled in it, we didn't see that much of a shift. So again, this is an area of opportunity. People are interested in hearing how everything's going, especially while they're enrolled in it. Again, not much of a shift here. We didn't see that many differences in terms of different subgroups, with the exception of the region. People that were from the Asia Pacific region mentioned that they received updates more often than other regions. If we can go to the next slide. So in terms of receiving results after they finished a clinical research study, there wasn't too much of a shift from 2017 to 2019. You'll see that the majority, 64% in 2017 and 61% in 2019, did not receive any study summaries once they had finished the study. However, there was some progress in terms of thank you cards. 22% reported receiving a thank you card, or some type of follow-up was also reported, via the study center, following up with the patient. So again, I think we're progressing in the right direction here. And Leslie, if we can go to the next slide. Overall satisfaction, again, a little bit of more of an a negative shift, I would say, from 2015 to 2019, where there was a higher proportion where, most of respondents that said it didn't meet their expectations. However, the majority did say that it met or exceeded their expectations in terms of experience. And a similar indicator of a positive experience was also where they rated the care and attention they received to be the same or better than what they would have traditionally otherwise received. Here, generally speaking, in terms of subgroup differences, younger people were more likely to say that their experience was fell shorter of their expectations than the older populations. And again, it's something that needs to be explored more deeply in future analyses. And in the next slide, this was a new question we asked in 2019. We gave respondents a list of words to describe how they felt after their last study visits. And the bigger the word, the more often it was used. And a lot of them said that they were calm or relieved. So generally, positive, but there is a lot of folks that said lost as well. That could be linked, or sad. That could be linked to not knowing next steps or being unclear on what their next steps should be, or just being sad that they may not see their medical study team again. But again, this is it was an interesting finding. In the next slide, again, most would be very willing to participate again. Another indicator of satisfaction. Respondents from North America were the most likely, and respondents from Asia and Pacific region were the least likely to say very willing. And older people generally were more willing than younger people. And finally, in the last slide, just to round things out, most would recommend participation. This hasn't shifted much from 2017 to 2019. The numbers are very similar. And again, younger people, again, we saw that same difference where they're less likely, less enthusiastic, let's say, than older people. And same thing with people from the Asia Pacific regions were also less likely to recommend versus other regions as well. So that rounds out the clinical trial experiences section. And now just to wrap up here, and then we'll save the last 5 minutes to perhaps answer some of the questions that have been coming in here. But I think overall, on a high level, general clinical research perceptions in terms of safety and general willingness to participate remain the same. But, low awareness is still an issue. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to connect with patients via various channels, depending on preferences and other variables. There's certainly an opportunity to leverage the relationships that patients have with their healthcare providers, given that they're such a trusted source of information, and these healthcare providers can certainly have an impact on raising participation rates. We're seeing technology and other patient engagement initiatives really having a positive impact on overall experiences. And as Jasmine mentioned, I think there's kind of a theme throughout. No one size fits all. Everybody's journey is different. Everybody has different personal lifestyle and work commitments, and fitting clinical trial participation into that lifestyle needs to be flexible as well in terms of different options that might be available to them. And then finally, there's a strong demand to maintain that engagement post-participation. We find, some of the prior study volunteers are the biggest champions of clinical research, and certainly, providing them with a summary of study results or other opportunities to stay involved is highly valued. Thank you again. In the last 4 minutes, we have some questions that came up. I think, if I remember seeing it, there was one question where I think one of the questions were the general willingness. There was an increase from 2017 to 2019, and I think that was probably likely driven by the fact that we had a higher proportion of prior study volunteers in our sample in 2019. And since prior study volunteers are generally more willing to participate, that probably drove the overall very willing numbers up. Leslie, I'll turn it over to you to manage the remaining questions.
Yeah, sure. So somebody had a comment saying that it was interesting that clinical trial experienced respondents don't rank as highly as naive respondents, and someone asked if that is consistent with prior year results.
So you mean for the ranking of, you mean the information that people ask for? I think, I guess I have to see which slide we're referring to here, but I think it may have been.
Oh, yes, for needs, I think, yeah.
And feel free to chime in if you want to unmute yourself. It is interesting. However, the general, I guess my comment on that is that the general priorities are generally the same. But you're right, it is interesting that those that didn't rank those as highly as those that have never participated.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. Is preference for type of site related to disease condition being studied?
So I think this was related to the different trial site models, and I think we haven't, because there were a significant number of different TAs, we certainly, this is something we're definitely looking at. And I'm sure there were some preferences depending on the condition, you know, in the particular clinical trial. So that's certainly something we're taking a look at. And Ken and Jasmine, feel free to chime in if you have anything else.
Yes. Then we just had one last question that I guess we can cover today. So can you clarify whether the advertisements were via social media or other routes? I think this was for one of our last slides.
Advertisements for the clinical trials. So we had a whole list of, so we had public, there were just the traditional advertisement that we had. So for example, like a TV or radio commercial. And then we had another separate social media option as well. So we had different online options as well. So it was much more broken out in the actual questionnaire.
Okay,
so
great.
Leslie, I just want to remind everyone who joined us, again, thank everyone. And I just wanted to remind or let everyone know that we're going to be publishing the results in bite-sized reports that will be topic-specific through CISCRP, and then we'll also be publishing some of the key findings in the peer review and trade journals. So keep your eyes out for a lot of those publications that'll have a lot more granular data as well.
Thanks, Ken. So it looks like we're just at the end of our time, so we'll need to close the webinar, but we will be answering any remaining questions in a follow-up email sent to all attendees. So I'd like to say thank you to our speakers for their informative and insightful presentations. I also want to thank you all for joining today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email with the webinar recorded link within 24 hours. So on behalf of CISCRP, thank you and have a great day.
And thank you, Leslie.